Today's video is brought to you by Manscaped.com, the premium brand for men's grooming and hygiene products. If you watch my channel for a while, you know that I appreciate Manscaped's product line, and this is a particularly exciting time because Manscaped has actually just released their 4th generation trimmer, the all-new Lawnmower 4.0. With feedback from millions of customers across the globe, the Manscaped team has engineered the next generation of groin and body trimmers by focusing on intelligent functionality. So this, as I say, is the Lawnmower 4.0. It's got these advanced ceramic blades right there at the top, and there's something called skin-safe technology, which, believe me, where this is designed to shave, you do want something called skin-safe technology. Nicks and cuts down below are just bad times. You turn it on, bum, off it goes, woo, and then I just say goodbye to some arm hair. It's cordless, it's waterproof so you can trim in the shower, it's super convenient. Also, when it comes to charging, this isn't a slouch like other trimmers. It's not going to die every 5 minutes. Indeed, you can get 90 minutes of charging from a full charge. And how do you charge? Well, it's waterproof, so it's wireless. Boom, slotted in there. Like an electric toothbrush, you do need to plug in this bottom part, but that is very easy enough through this port in the back. Easy peasy. So start looking good from head to toe with no pair of stones left unturned. Join more than 2 million men worldwide who trust Manscaped. Go to manscaped.com/biographics and get 20% off plus free international shipping. Again, manscaped.com/biographics, link below. So, do we really need an introduction for Pablo Picasso? It is difficult to argue against the idea that he was the most important, influential, and recognizable artist of the 20th century. In today's Biographics, we will explore the turning points of his career and the salient events of his private life. Many of these events were controversial, to say the least, and would have dire consequences for those lucky enough or unlucky enough to be close to the painter. But we have 9 decades to cover, so let's dip our brushes and get right into it. It was the 25th of October, 1881, in Malaga, Andalusia, southern Spain. Local painter, arts teacher, and museum curator Jose Ruiz Blasco and his wife Maria Picasso y Lopez welcomed their firstborn child. This baby would later sign his masterpieces simply as Picasso, but he was christened as Pablo Diego Jose Francisco de Paula Juan Nepomuceno Maria de los Remedios Cipriano de la Santísima Trinidad Ruiz Picasso. Oh my god, that was an insane mouthful, and I'm sure I destroyed the pronunciation on it. With a name like that, we may consider his birth certificate as his first work of art. Many would follow from an early age. Boy Pablo was introduced to art by his father, a good teacher with great technical knowledge. Picasso would later acknowledge the strong influence that his mother and aunts had on him. His mother, Maria, in particular, would boost his ego, telling him things like, "When you grow up, if you are a soldier, you will become general. If you are a priest, you will become pope." The strong feminine influence on Pablo have led some biographers to infer an Oedipal complex and a strong antagonism towards his father. But actually, Picasso always respected his father, Jose, and acknowledged his teachings and influence. He would later say, "Every time I draw a man, automatically I think of my father. As far as I am concerned, the man is Don Jose, and that will be so as long as I live." As Pablo grew up, his father realized his incredible talent, sometimes asking the boy to finish his paintings for him. Pablo would also create his own works of art, at the time still inspired by classic, conventional, and academic art. But he already showed a keen eye for certain subjects that would re-emerge in later life, bullfighting, for example. By 1891, the Ruiz Picassos were not doing great financially, and Pablo had been joined by younger sisters Concepcion and Lola, and just when Don Jose could do with some extra money, the municipality of Malaga had shut down the museum that he was working at. Dad was suddenly jobless, so he relocated the entire family to La Coruña on the northwestern coast of Spain. There he was offered a new job as a drawing teacher, with Pablo as one of his students. At the age of 14, young Ruiz Picasso was painting oil paintings of family friends, but also subjects that were more on the fringes of society. The celebration and representation of misfits would be another recurring theme in Picasso's career. Worth mentioning from this period, The Old Fisherman and The Barefoot Girl. Then, in 1895, the family experienced a tragedy. Daughter, Concepcion, known as Conchita, contracted diphtheria. Pablo made a pact with God. He would renounce painting if he let Conchita survive. Unfortunately, she died. According to biographer John Richardson, this left a profound and lasting sense of guilt in Pablo's psyche. After the tragedy, the family moved again, this time to Barcelona. Here, Don Jose would be teaching at La Loña, the most prominent local art school. The move was a godsend for Pablo. Barcelona was a thriving cultural center influenced by artistic innovators that emanated from Paris. Again, Pablo enrolled in his father's school, impressing other teachers and examiners with his maturing techniques. In 1896, Pablo started to attract the attention of the press and prize juries thanks to his canvases, Science and Charity, and First Communion. By depicting this Catholic rite of passage, Pablo marked his own symbolic transition from childhood to adulthood, from student to future maestro. In the autumn of 1897, Pablo left Barcelona to study at the Royal Academy of San Fernando in Madrid. This was a great opportunity, but he disliked their stuffy curriculum and preferred to spend hours at the Prado Museum admiring the masters. His poor attendance record angered Don Jose, who decided to cut Pablo's allowance. The young painter spent a miserable winter in Madrid. He was cold, ill, and penniless. A friend, Manuel Palares, came to the rescue, inviting him to spend 8 months in his native village in Catalonia, Horta de Ebro. This was a small town on the mountains, geographically and culturally far removed from the bustle of Madrid and Barcelona that Pablo loved so much. And yet the months in Horta were a crucial transformative moment, another rite of passage. Pablo would later often say, "Everything I know, I learned in Palares village." In Horta, Pablo learned how to harvest hay and grapes, how to shear sheep and slaughter pigs. He connected with nature and the traditions of rural Catalonia. He removed himself from civilization as he and Manuel retired for weeks at a cave. There, Pablo honed his skills, sketching and painting the landscapes and the local people. In February 1899, he had regained his health and his energy. He was going to return to Barcelona, no longer as a student, but as an artist, ready to take on the world. Back in Barcelona, Pablo's favorite haunts became the tavern Els Quatre Gats, or The Four Cats. This cafe was modeled after the famous Parisian cabaret Le Chat Noir, a microcosm of young and daring intellectuals and artists. Pablo stood out thanks to his charisma and energy, soon making friends with painter Carlos Casagemas and poet James Sabates. Pablo began to make a name for himself, but that name wasn't Pablo, it was Picasso. His Catalan friends decided that his father's surname Ruiz was too commonplace for such an original character. His mother's instead had an exotic ring which suited the young artist. In February 1900, the 18-year-old Picasso exhibited 150 works at the Four Cats. It was such a success that several drawings were published, and one painting, Last Moments, was chosen for the Universal Exposition in Paris. After this success, Picasso decided to move to Paris. After all, that's where the real art was at. In October of 1900, Picasso and his friend Casagemas moved into a studio in Montmartre, where they drank life to the dregs. They frequented artists, dancers, cafes, museums, and houses of ill repute. Picasso fell in love with Toulouse-Lautrec and Degas and found a good client in an art dealer in Pedro Menach. Carlos Casagemas, meanwhile, fell in love with a young lady, Laure Gargallo, known as Germaine. Germaine eventually rejected Carles, who may have already been suffering from depression. On February the 17th, 1901, Picasso was back in Barcelona when he received dour news. Casagemas had tried to shoot Germaine, missed her, and later turned the gun on himself. And Picasso was deeply shocked. In 1901, he dedicated 3 paintings to his friend, the most famous one being The Death of Casagemas. A large candle on the right-hand side illuminates the background in strong hues of red, orange, yellow, and green. In sharp contrast, the face of Carles in the foreground is tinted in pale blues and greens. In Picasso's own words, the death of his friend initiated what became known as his blue period. This is when he painted almost in monochrome, favoring shades of blue and blue-green, only occasionally using other colors. The themes are also subtly blue, or permeated by a sense of sadness, desolation, and depression. Typical subjects of the blue period include prisoners, beggars, or traveling performers like The Old Guitarist from 1903. The painting gives Picasso the occasion to celebrate the downtrodden of society, but The Old Blind Musician and his angular posture are also a homage to one of Picasso's favorites, El Greco. After the death of Casagemas, Picasso returned to Paris in May of 1901. Here, he lived briefly in his friend's old apartment and even had a short relationship with Germaine. Between 1901 and 1904, the painter traveled back and forth between Paris and Spain, further developing his style and technique. Perhaps influenced by his friends and poet Max Jacob, Picasso's art drifted away from reality. Instead, he tried to express the subjective and spiritual experiences of what he was living. During another period of financial hardship, Picasso could not afford oil paint. He had to resort to drawing only, which refined his technique and made him pay greater attention to space and anatomy. Finally, after settling in Paris for good in April of 1904, Picasso was about to shed his old blue skin and enter a new period, tinted in rose. The Rose period covers Picasso's activity from 1904 to 1906. The cold and somber blues gradually gave way to a warmer palette dominated by pink, orange, and red. The subjects appeared less desperate than those in the blue period, but still had an air of pensive melancholy. They were often circus troupes or street urchins who frequented the Bateau Lavoir, a building hosting dozens of small artists' studios. One of them is The Boy with a Pipe, portrayed in 1905. At the Bateau Lavoir, Picasso met and fell in love with a model, Ferdinand Olivier, who did not find him particularly seductive. Even still, she could not deny that the inner fire that you felt in him gave off a kind of magnetism. The two began an affair, and Ferdinand became the painter's muse. He venerated her, but adoration came with darker shades: possessiveness and jealousy. Picasso insisted that Ferdinand give up modeling, and when she expressed a desire to paint, Pablo dismissed her aspirations, saying that women should not trespass into male territory. Every time Picasso left their apartment, he locked her inside and took away the key. He agreed to give her a key only when she almost died in a house fire. It was one of the earliest signs that Picasso struggled to maintain normal, healthy relationships with women. Artistically, though, Picasso was finding new heights. Critics, collectors, and other artists all took notice of the Rose period artworks. Picasso made influential friends such as writer and art patron Gertrude Stein, poet Guillaume Apollinaire, writers Jean Cocteau, and Francis Scott Fitzgerald. As his popularity grew, Picasso was ready to shed his new skin and enter a new period, which would eventually lead him to cubism. From autumn 1905 to autumn of 1906, the painter absorbed a string of influences that would ultimately shape his remaining work, changing the art world forever. Picasso began studying the work of Paul Cézanne, absorbing his concept that the artist should capture the process rather than the result of vision. This allowed artists to depict multiple angles of the same object at once, free from the constraints of one-point perspective. Then, in the summer of 1906, Picasso and Fernand took a trip to Gossel in Catalonia. Here, Pablo took to carving wooden sculptures, which influenced his later depiction of the human face. Finally, after returning to Paris, the painter visited exhibitions of prehistoric Spanish sculpture, as well as African and oceanic masks. All of these influences can be seen in his portrait of Gertrude Stein of 1906, in which Picasso radically simplified her face into a stylized mask. It could be said that this is when Pablo stopped painting what he saw and started painting what he thought. The influences of the past months erupted into a watershed work of art: the Demoiselles d'Avignon, or the Young Women of Avignon. The original title of The Brothel of Avignon, in reference to a street in Barcelona known for prostitution, not the French town. So yes, there was absolutely no mystery on these young ladies' professional status. That explains the bold and solicitous gaze of the five women with a noted undercurrent of sexual tension. The painting shocked Picasso's friends and critics, not only for its theme, but especially for the technique that he used. He distorted the body of the models, challenging the traditional idealization of female beauty. Moreover, he omitted perspective. There is no vanishing point, nowhere for the eye to escape, no way to avoid the young women and their glance. The large canvas was the turning point away from the African or primitivist period and into Cubism. Picasso developed this style in partnership with painter Georges Braque, both influenced by Cézanne. The two sliced the pictorial space, attempting to see all angles at once. They ditched scale and perspective. Shapes were simplified into blocks. They painted the analysis of a form instead of its appearance. They also introduced the technique of collage by embedding found objects or even trash into their work. They performed an unprecedented synthesis, combining everyday chaos into the beauty of art. Pablo's art started selling well, and in the autumn of 1909, he and Fernand were able to move into a proper apartment together. 2 years later, just when his fame was soaring, Pablo dumped his muse, beginning an affair with model Eva Guel. The paintings she inspired are marked by the words "Ma jolie," my beautiful. Fame brought some unwanted attention too. When the Mona Lisa was stolen from the Louvre in August 1911, poet Guillaume Apollinaire and Picasso were celebrity suspects. Picasso was innocent, of course, although he confessed to buying Iberian statuettes pilfered from the Louvre. Almost exactly 3 years later, Apollinaire would go through a much worse ordeal. As World War I broke out, he was called to arms. The same fate befell many in Picasso's circle, but not him. As a citizen of neutral Spain, he was under no obligation to serve. All he suffered was solitude and melancholy, made worse in December of 1915 when Eva died of tuberculosis. A depressed Picasso was rescued by Jean Cocteau. In March of 1916, he involved the painter in Parade, a show of ballet Russes, which was a troupe led by ballet impresario Sergei Diaghilev. Picasso designed stage decor and masks for the dancers, all in cubist style. He even got to tour with the troupe. While visiting Rome, Pompeii, and Naples in 1917, he absorbed the influence of ancient classical art. At the same time, he courted one of the dancers, Ukrainian Olga Kokolova. Not one to move slow, Picasso and Olga were married 1 year later, and she became his leading muse, inspiring some 140 works of art that belonged to his next phase, the classic period. In the first works, Olga is portrayed as a delicate and melancholic beauty. Later, she morphs into a disfigured, threatening presence. But she was not the monster in this story. Over the course of their marriage, Picasso had several affairs, physically assaulted Olga, and even kept her sedated when it was convenient for him. In November of 1921, Picasso dumped her just when she was pregnant with their first child, Pablo. Picasso and Olga tried to reconcile, but in 1927 he started a new affair just when Olga's health was deteriorating due to cancer. The new mistress was 17-year-old Marie-Therese Walter. He had met her by total chance outside a department store. Captivated by her beauty, the painter grabbed the girl by her arm and said, "I am Picasso. You and I are going to do great things together." What they did together was, well, you can use your imagination on that one. Their relationship was passionate and intensely sexual, possibly with a sadistic element to it. It appears that Marie-Therese was at times terrified of having sex with Picasso, who enjoyed seeing her cry. This type of relationship permeated works like Figures at the Seaside of 1931. The canvas is full of sexual symbols, but there is a threatening element to it. Stylistically, Figures also portrays the influence of the Surrealist movement and Picasso's friendship with Salvador Dali. On September 5, 1935, Marie-Therese gave birth to Picasso's daughter, Maya, who he would portray frequently for the rest of his life. The couple instead split shortly afterwards, occasionally reigniting their affair. Many years later, in 1977, Marie-Therese Walter hung herself. Another relationship concluded over the summer of 1935. This is when Olga left Pablo for good, although he never conceded a divorce. Their marriage officially ended only on February the 11th, 1955, when she died of cancer. 1935 was a troubled year in general. Picasso had been going through a creative block. Once a darling of the press and the avant-garde circles, he was now facing negative reviews. The master was settling into a pattern. He needed to enter a new period to revitalize his art, and to enter a new period, he was going to need a new muse. Quite promptly, a new muse came right along. Poet, painter, and photographer Henriette Theodora Markovich, better known as Dora Maar. She was at Picasso's side from 1936 to 1943, but the inspiration for Picasso's best-known work would not come from love, but from tragedy. On July the 18th, 1936, the Spanish Civil War broke out. The conflict opposed to the Republican government was a military insurgency, the Bando Nacional. The officers were initially led by General Sanjuanjo and later by General Franco, who secured military help from fascist Italy and Nazi Germany. In 1937, the Republican government asked Picasso to paint a mural for the Spanish Pavilion at the Paris Universal Exposition. The painter chose the subject after hearing the news from Guernica, a Republican stronghold in Basque country victory in northern Spain. On April 26, 1937, 45 Italian and German planes carpet-bombed and strafed Guernica. They destroyed 70% of the town and killed or wounded 1,600 civilians, which was a third of the population. This was the first instance of large-scale bombing used against a civilian target, an omen of the impending horrors of the near future. Picasso denounced the massacre by painting a monumental canvas 3.5 meters tall and 7.8 meters wide. He painted quickly to meet the deadline of the exhibition. Dora Maar's photos documented the process, providing some insight into how Picasso changed his mind several times on the composition of the canvas, even down to the choice of colors. Halfway through the process, perhaps inspired by Dora's own black and white photos, Picasso decided to adopt an almost monochromatic palette: black, dark blue, and white. Another pseudo-improvised element is the head of the horse at the center of the canvas. Taken together with the bull on the left, these animals represent the most dominant elements. The horse represents the suffering of the people of Guernica, while the bull embodies brutality and darkness. Guernica helped to further cement Picasso's reputation worldwide. He was even honored with a large exhibition at New York's MoMA in 1939. When the German army occupied Paris in June of 1940, Picasso benefited in part from his international standing. He was clearly an anti-fascist and a producer of degenerate art, but the occupation authorities allowed him to continue to work. Sometimes German officials would try to offer him extra privileges, sometimes as simple as extra coal or food rations. Naturally, they were expecting some works of art in exchange, but Picasso never accepted these exchanges. All he ever gave these officials were postcards of Guernica to be kept as a souvenir. During the occupation years, his work reflected the grim reality of the period. In paintings like Seated Woman, subject matter focused on the private, introspective sphere. The colors are dull, the shapes aggressive, the mood claustrophobic. Picasso also expressed himself through sculpture, with the best example being Man with a Lamb, which has been interpreted both as a symbol of suffering under German yoke and hope for impending liberation. In May of 1943, Picasso was ready for another transition in his personal life. He met the young aspiring painter François Gillot while still living with Dora. Occasionally, he still saw his former lover, Marie-Therese Walter. He cut ties with both Walter and Dora in order to start a new relationship with Gillot, which would almost last 10 years. The couple had 2 children, Claude in 1947 and Paloma in 1949, but their affair was plagued by infidelity and emotional abuse. Picasso explained very clearly to François that for him, there are only 2 kinds of women: goddesses and doormats. Gillot was not willing to become a doormat, so she instead became the only woman to ever leave Picasso in 1953. She later published a memoir on their life together, revealing some of the artist's neuroses and darker traits. Picasso alternated between bouts of depression, uncontrollable temper, and absolute sadism, which he expressed in the form of cruel pranks. He also had a tendency to ruminate obsessively on single ideas or topics and maintained compulsive rituals. For example, every morning he had to recite mentally a list of his closest friends. One day he forgot to include his friend Maurice Raynal. Later in that day, he learned of his unexpected death and was deeply perturbed. This episode shows how, as a balance to Picasso's myriad of negative traits, he could care deeply about others, friends, certain family members, and the general downtrodden of society. As a result of his relationship with Gillot, who was a communist sympathizer, Picasso shifted decidedly to the left. In fact, after the end of the German occupation, he formally joined the French Communist Party. In the following years, he painted party posters and a portrait of Stalin. He accepted the Lenin Peace Prize in 1950 and attracted the attention of US authorities with Massacre in Korea. This 1951 canvas was a commentary on US atrocities committed against North Korean civilians. Eventually, Picasso came under FBI scrutiny, who suspected him of spying on behalf of the USSR. But politics were not the major concern of the Maestro, who was now in his 70s. He had started yet another new relationship with a lady who had become his final love and muse, Jacqueline Roch, 47 years his junior. The two would marry in 1961, and Jacqueline would be portrayed more than 70 times by the aging painter, marking by far the most productive years of his long career. Picasso had entered a period of frenzied activity, dedicated to revisiting and recreating works by early masters that he admired. Starting in 1957, he produced 58 works, in which he reinterpreted Las Meninas, a 17th century masterpiece by Diego de Velázquez. From 1959 to 1961, he applied the same approach to Luncheon on the Grass by Monet. The series, inspired by the Impressionist, consists of 140 drawings, 27 paintings, and 4 linoleum cuts. During the 1960s, Picasso's most recurring theme was the female nude. It was as if, approaching death, the old master wanted to delay as much as possible the threats of decay and impotence. Such a vast amount of work required peace and quiet, which Pablo and Jacqueline sought by moving to the secluded Château de WWII in southern France. While there, Jacqueline would make sure the master's time was protected, barring even his eldest son Pablo from visiting him. In 1964, Picasso himself extended the veto to his other children, Claude and Paloma. The reason was the publication of his former lover, François Gillot's aforementioned memoir, Life with Picasso. Picasso sued his former lover and tried to prevent the publication of the work, but the court involved concluded that this work, far from defaming the great painter, reveals him as a man of astonishing interior richness and an extremely attractive figure. Pablo Ruiz Picasso died on April 8, 1973, aged 91. Jacqueline spent the night next to his body, laid out on a mound of snow. Picasso was a colossus of the art world, the personification of genius. His life spanned 9 decades, and his vision influenced the creation of some of the most important movements in modern art. The engine that propelled his work were his passions, the lessons from the old masters, politics, society, and most of all, his muses. And yet that same passionate heart that could create so easily and could elevate those around him could destroy just as easily. Olga, Pablo's first wife, was abused and neglected while ill with cancer. Marie-Therese Walter ultimately took her own life, and so did Jacqueline Roch after years of alcoholism and depression. Dora Maar was also abused, eventually suffering a mental breakdown. Picasso seemed to have a deleterious influence on blood relatives too. His son Pablo died an alcoholic after years of depression. Paolo's son, Pablito, poisoned himself with a bottle of bleach, and he was barred from his grandfather's funeral. So, while the world rightfully remembers him as the master painter of the 20th century and the founder of cubism, so too was he a lecherous eccentric, slowly scraping the life off the many friends and family members in his orbit. Picasso's muses may have given him inspiration, but that transaction rarely came without personal cost. Such was the nature of a complex artistic visionary. As Pablito's sister Marina described it, he submitted them to his animal sexuality, tamed them, bewitched them, ingested them, and crushed them into his canvas. After he had spent many nights extracting their essence, once they were bled dry, he would dispose of them. So I hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below. Don't forget to subscribe. Please do check out our fantastic sponsor, Manscaped, who I'm linking to below. And thank you for watching.